Section 3 of Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Inatsu Nitobe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Benevolence and Politeness. When valor attains this height, it becomes akin to benevolence, the feeling of distress, love, magnanimity, affection for others, sympathy, and pity, which were ever recognized to be supreme virtues, the highest of all attributes of the human soul. Benevolence was deemed a princely virtue in a twofold sense: princely among the manifold attributes of a noble spirit, princely as particularly befitting a princely profession. We needed no Shakespeare to feel, though perhaps, like the rest of the world, we needed him to express it, that mercy became a monarch better than his crown, that it was above his sceptred sway. How often both Confucius and Mencius repeat the highest requirement of a ruler of men to consist in benevolence. Confucius would say, quote, "Let but a prince cultivate virtue, people will flock to him. With people will come to him lands, lands will bring forth for him wealth, wealth will give him the benefit of right uses. Virtue is the root, and wealth an outcome." End quote. Again, quote, "Never has there been a case of a sovereign loving benevolence and the people not loving righteousness." End quote. Mencius follows close at his heels and says, quote, "Instances are on record where individuals attained to supreme power in a single state, without benevolence, but never have I heard of a whole empire falling into the hands of one who lacked this virtue." End quote. Also, quote, "It is impossible that anyone should become ruler of the people to whom they have not yielded the subjection of their hearts." End quote. Both defined this indispensable requirement in a ruler by saying, quote, "Benevolence. Benevolence is man." End quote. Under the regime of feudalism, which could easily be perverted into militarism, it was to benevolence that we owed our deliverance from despotism of the worst kind. An utter surrender of life and limb on the part of the governed would have left nothing for the governing but self-will, and this has for its natural consequence the growth of that absolutism so often called Oriental despotism, as though there were no despots of Occidental history. Let it be far from me to uphold despotism of any sort, but it is a mistake to identify feudalism with it. When Frederick the Great wrote that, quote, "Kings are the first servants of the state," end quote, jurists thought rightly that a new era was reached in the development of freedom. Strangely coinciding in time in the backwoods of northwestern Japan, Yozan of Yonezawa made exactly the same declaration, showing that feudalism was not all tyranny and oppression. A feudal prince, although unmindful of owing reciprocal obligations to his vassals, felt a higher sense of responsibility to his ancestors and to heaven. He was a father to his subjects, whom heaven entrusted to his care. In a sense not usually assigned to the term, Bushido accepted and corroborated paternal government. Paternal also as opposed to the less interested avuncular government, Uncle Sam's to wit. The difference between a despotic and a paternal government lies in this, that in the one the people obey reluctantly, while in the other they do so with, quote, "that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of heart, which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of exalted freedom." End quote. Footnote: Burke, French Revolution. End footnote. The old saying is not entirely false, which called the King of England the, quote, "King of Devils," because of his subjects' often insurrections against and depositions of their princes, end quote, and which made the French monarch the, quote, "King of Asses," because of their infinite taxes and impositions, end quote. but which gave the title of, quote, the King of Men, end quote, to the sovereign of Spain, quote, because of his subjects' willing obedience, end quote. But enough. Virtue and absolute power may strike the Anglo-Saxon mind as terms which it is impossible to harmonize. Pobedonostsev has clearly set before us the contrast in the foundations of English and other European communities, namely that these were organized on the basis of common interest, while that was distinguished by a strongly developed independent personality. What this Russian statesman says of the personal dependence of individuals on some social alliance, and in the end of ends of the state, among the continental nations of Europe, and particularly among Slavonic peoples, is doubly true of the Japanese. Hence, not only is a free exercise of monarchical power not felt as heavily by us as in Europe, but it is generally moderated by parental consideration for the feelings of the people. Quote, absolutism, says Bismarck, primarily demands in the ruler impartiality, honesty, devotion to duty, energy, and inward humility, end quote. If I may be allowed to make one more quotation on this subject, I will cite from the speech of the German Emperor at Koblenz, in which he spoke of, quote, kingship, by the grace of God, with its heavy duties, its tremendous responsibility to the Creator alone, from which no man, no minister, no parliament can release the monarch, end quote. We knew benevolence was a tender virtue and mother-like. If upright rectitude and stern justice were peculiarly masculine, mercy had the gentleness and the persuasiveness of a feminine nature. We were warned against indulging in indiscriminate charity, without seasoning it with justice and rectitude. Masamune expressed it well in his oft-quoted aphorism, quote, rectitude carried to excess hardens into stiffness. Benevolence, indulged beyond measure, sinks into weakness, end quote. Fortunately, mercy was not so rare as it was beautiful, for it is universally true that, quote, the bravest are the tenderest, the loving are the daring, end quote. Bushi no Nasake, the tenderness of a warrior, had a sound which appealed at once to whatever was noble in us. Not that the mercy of a samurai was generically different from the mercy of any other being, but because it implied mercy where mercy was not a blind impulse, but where it recognized due regard to justice, and where mercy did not remain merely a certain state of mind, but where it was backed with power to save or kill. As economists speak of demand as being effectual or ineffectual, similarly we may call the mercy of Bushi effectual, since it implied the power of acting for the good or detriment of the recipient. Priding themselves as they did in their brute strength and privileges to turn it into account, the samurai gave full consent to what Mencius taught concerning the power of love. Quote, benevolence, he says, brings under its sway whatever hinders its power, just as water subdues fire. They only doubt the power of water to quench flames who try to extinguish with a cupful a whole burning wagon-load of faggots, end quote. He also says that, quote, the feeling of distress is the root of benevolence. Therefore, a benevolent man is ever mindful of those who are suffering and in distress, end quote. Thus did Mencius long anticipate Adam Smith, who founds his ethical philosophy on sympathy. It is indeed striking how closely the code of knightly honor of one country coincides with that of others. In other words, how the much abused Oriental ideas of morals find their counterparts in the noblest maxims of European literature. If the well-known lines, He tibi erunt artes, pacisque imponere morum, parser subjectus et debellere superbos, were shown a Japanese gentleman, he might readily accuse the Manchuan bard of plagiarizing from the literature of his own country. Benevolence to the weak, the downtrodden, or the vanquished was ever extolled as peculiarly becoming to a samurai. Lovers of Japanese art must be familiar with the representation of a priest riding backwards on a cow. The rider was once a warrior who, in his day, made his name a byword of terror. In that terrible battle of Sumano-ura, 1184 A.D., which was one of the most decisive in our history, he overtook an enemy and in single combat had him in the clutch of his gigantic arms. Now the etiquette of war required that on such occasions no blood should be spilt, unless the weaker party proved to be a man of rank or ability equal to that of the stronger. The grim combatant would have the name of the man under him, but he, refusing to make it known, his helmet was ruthlessly torn off, when the sight of a juvenile face, fair and beardless, made the astonished knight relax his hold. Helping the youth to his feet, in paternal tones, he bade the stripling go. Quote, "Off, young prince, to thy mother's side. The sword of Kumagaye shall never be tarnished by a drop of thy blood. Haste and flee o'er yon pass before thy enemies come in sight." End quote. The young warrior refused to go, and begged Kumagaye for the honor of both to dispatch him on the spot. Above the hoary head of the veteran gleams the cold blade, which many a time before has sundered the cords of life, but his stout heart quails. There flashes athwart his mental eye the vision of his own boy, who this self-same day marched to the sound of bugle to try his maiden arms. The strong hand of the warrior quivers. Again he begs his victim to flee for his life. Finding all his entreaties vain, and hearing the approaching steps of his comrades, he exclaims, quote, "If thou art overtaken, thou mayest fall at a more ignoble hand than mine. O thou infinite, receive his soul." End quote. In an instant the sword flashes in the air, and when it falls it is red with adolescent blood. When the war is ended, we find our soldier returning in triumph, but little cares he now for honor or fame. He renounces his warlike career, shaves his head, dons a priestly garb, devotes the rest of his days to holy pilgrimage, never turning his back to the west, where lies the paradise whence salvation comes, and whither the sun hastes daily for his rest. Critics may point out flaws in this story, which is casuistically vulnerable. Let it be. All the same, it shows that tenderness, pity, and love were traits which adorned the most sanguinary exploits of the samurai. It was an old maxim among them that, quote, "It becometh not the fowler to slay the bird which takes refuge in his bosom." End quote. This, in a large measure, explains why the Red Cross movement, considered peculiarly Christian, so readily found a firm footing among us. For decades before we heard of the Geneva Convention, Bakken, our greatest novelist, had familiarized us with the medical treatment of a fallen foe. In the Principality of Satsuma, noted for its martial spirit and education, the custom prevailed for young men to practice music, not the blast of trumpets or the beat of drums, quote, "those clamorous harbingers of blood and death," end quote, stirring us to imitate the actions of a tiger, but sad and tender melodies on the biwa. Footnote: a musical instrument resembling the guitar. End footnote. Soothing our fiery spirits, drawing our thoughts away from the scent of blood and scenes of carnage. Polybius tells us of the constitution of Arcadia, which required all youths under 30 to practice music, in order that this gentle art might alleviate the rigors of that inclement region. It is to its influence that he attributes the absence of cruelty in that part of the Arcadian mountains. Nor was Satsuma the only place in Japan where gentleness was inculcated among the warrior class. a prince of Shirakawa, jots down his random thoughts, and among them is the following, quote, "Though they come stealing to your bedside in the silent watches of the night, drive not away, but rather cherish these, the fragrance of flowers, the sound of distant bells, the insect humming of a frosty night." End quote. And again, quote, "Though they may wound your feelings, these three you have only to forgive: the breeze that scatters your flowers, the cloud that hides your moon, and the man who tries to pick quarrels with you." End quote. It was ostensibly to express, but actually to cultivate, these gentler emotions that the writing of verses was encouraged. Our poetry has therefore a strong undercurrent of pathos and tenderness. A well-known anecdote of a rustic samurai illustrates a case in point. When he was told to learn versification and, quote, "the warbler's notes," end quote, footnote, the uguisu, or warbler, sometimes called the nightingale of Japan, end footnote, was given him for the subject of his first attempt. His fiery spirit rebelled, and he flung at the feet of his master this uncouth production, which ran, quote, "The brave warrior keeps apart the ear that might listen to the warbler's song," end quote. His master, undaunted by the crude sentiment, continued to encourage the youth, until one day the music of his soul was awakened to respond to the sweet notes of the uguisu, and he wrote, quote, "Stands the warrior mailed and strong to hear the uguisu's song, warbled sweet the trees among." End quote. We admire and enjoy the heroic incident in Koerner's short life, when, as he lay wounded on the battlefield, he scribbled his famous, quote, "Farewell to life," end quote. Incidents of a similar kind were not at all unusual in our warfare. Our pithy, epigrammatic poems were particularly well suited to the improvisation of a single sentiment. Everybody of any education was either a poet or a poetaster. Not infrequently a marching soldier might be seen to halt, take his writing utensils from his belt, and compose an ode, and such papers were found afterward in the helmets or the breastplates when these were removed from their lifeless wearers. What Christianity has done in Europe toward rousing compassion in the midst of belligerent horrors, love of music and letters has done in Japan. The cultivation of tender feelings breeds considerate regard for the sufferings of others. Modesty and complacence, actuated by respect for others' feelings, are at the root of politeness, that courtesy and urbanity of manners which has been noticed by every foreign tourist as a marked Japanese trait. Politeness is a poor virtue, if it is actuated only by a fear of offending good taste, whereas it should be the outward manifestation of a sympathetic regard for the feelings of others. It also implies a due regard for the fitness of things, therefore due respect to social positions, for these latter express no plutocratic distinctions, but were originally distinctions for actual merit. In its highest form, politeness almost approaches love. We may reverently say, politeness, quote, "suffereth long and is kind, envieth not, vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, taketh not account of evil." End quote. Is it any wonder that Professor Dean, in speaking of the 6 elements of humanity, accords to politeness an exalted position, inasmuch as it is the ripest fruit of social intercourse? While thus extolling politeness, far be it from me to put it in the front rank of virtues. If we analyze it, we shall find it correlated with other virtues of a higher order, for what virtue stands alone? While, or rather because, it was exalted as peculiar to the profession of arms, and as such esteemed in a degree higher than its deserts, there came into existence its counterfeits. Confucius himself has repeatedly taught that external appurtenances are as little a part of propriety as sounds are of music. When propriety was elevated to the sine qua non of social intercourse, it was only to be expected that an elaborate system of etiquette should come into vogue to train youth in correct social behavior. How one must bow in accosting others, how he must walk and sit, were taught and learned with utmost care. Table manners grew to be a science. Tea serving and drinking were raised to a ceremony. A man of education is, of course, expected to be master of all these. Very fitly does Mr. Veblen, in his interesting book, footnote, Theory of the Leisure Class, New York, 1899, page 46, end footnote, call decorum, quote, a product and an exponent of the leisure class life, end quote. I have heard slighting remarks made by Europeans upon our elaborate discipline of politeness. It has been criticized as absorbing too much of our thought, and in so far a folly to observe strict obedience to it. I admit that there may be unnecessary niceties in ceremonies etiquette, but whether it partakes as much of folly as the adherence to ever-changing fashions of the West is a question not very clear to my mind. Even fashions I do not consider solely as freaks of vanity. On the contrary, I look upon these as a ceaseless search of the human mind for the beautiful. Much less do I consider elaborate ceremony as altogether trivial, for it denotes the result of long observation as to the most appropriate method of achieving a certain result. If there is anything to do, there is certainly a best way to do it, and the best way is both the most economical and the most graceful. Mr. Spencer defines grace as the most economical manner of motion. The tea ceremony presents certain definite ways of manipulating a bowl, a spoon, a napkin, etc. To a novice it looks tedious, but one soon discovers that the way prescribed is, after all, the most saving of time and labor. In other words, the most economical use of force. Hence, according to Spencer's dictum, the most graceful. The spiritual significance of social decorum, or, I might say, to borrow from the vocabulary of the philosophy of clothes, the spiritual discipline of which etiquette and ceremony are mere outward garments, is out of all proportion to what their appearance warrants us in believing. I might follow the example of Mr. Spencer, and trace in our ceremonial institutions their origins and the moral motives that gave rise to them. But that is not what I shall endeavor to do in this book. It is the moral training involved in strict observance of propriety that I wish to emphasize. I have said that etiquette was elaborated into the finest niceties, so much so that different schools advocating different systems came into existence. But they all united in the ultimate essential, and this was put by a great exponent of the best-known school of etiquette, the Ogasawara, in the following terms, quote, the end of all etiquette is to so cultivate your mind that even when you are quietly seated, not the roughest ruffian can dare make onset on your person. Unquote. It means, in other words, that by constant exercise in correct manners, one brings all the parts and faculties of his body into perfect order and into such harmony with itself and its environment as to express the mastery of spirit over the flesh. What a new and deep significance the French word bienséance, footnote, etymologically, well seated, end footnote, comes thus to contain. If the premise is true that gracefulness means economy of force, then it follows as a logical sequence that a constant practice of graceful deportment must bring with it a reserve and storage of force. Fine manners, therefore, mean power and repose. When the barbarian Gauls, during the sack of Rome, burst into the assembled Senate and dared pull the beards of the venerable fathers, we think the old gentlemen were to blame, inasmuch as they lacked dignity and strength of manners. Is lofty spiritual attainment really possible through etiquette? Why not? All roads lead to Rome. As an example of how the simplest thing can be made into an art, and then become spiritual culture, I may take Cha no Yu, the tea ceremony. Tea-sipping as a fine art. Why should it not be? In the children drawing pictures on the sand, or in the savage carving on a rock, was the promise of a Raphael or a Michelangelo. How much more is the drinking of a beverage which began with the transcendental contemplation of a Hindu anchorite, entitled to develop into a handmaid of religion and morality. That calmness of mind, that serenity of temper, that composure and quietness of demeanor, which are the first essentials of Cha no Yu, are without doubt the first conditions of right thinking and right feeling. The scrupulous cleanliness of the little room, shut off from sight and sound of the madding crowd, is in itself conducive to direct one's thoughts from the world. The bare interior does not engross one's attention, like the innumerable pictures and bric-a-brac of a Western parlor. The presence of kakemono, footnote, hanging scrolls which may be either paintings or ideograms used for decorative purposes, end footnote, calls our attention more to grace of design than to beauty of color. The utmost refinement of taste is the object aimed at, whereas anything like display is banished with religious horror. The very fact that it was invented by a contemplative recluse in a time when wars and the rumors of wars were incessant is well calculated to show that this institution was more than a pastime. Before entering the quiet precincts of the tea-room, the company assembling to partake of the ceremony laid aside, together with their swords, the ferocity of the battlefield or the cares of government, there to find peace and friendship. Cha no Yu is more than a ceremony. It is a fine art. It is poetry, with articulate gestures for rhythm. It is a modus operandi of soul discipline. Its greatest value lies in this last phase. Not infrequently the other phases preponderated in the mind of its votaries, but that does not prove that its essence was not of a spiritual nature. Politeness will be a great acquisition if it does no more than impart grace to manners, but its function does not stop here. For propriety, springing as it does from motives of benevolence and modesty, and actuated by tender feelings towards the sensibility of others, is ever a graceful expression of sympathy. Its requirement is that we should weep with those that weep, and rejoice with those that rejoice. Such didactic requirements, when reduced into small everyday details of life, expresses itself in little acts scarcely noticeable, or, if noticed, is, as one missionary lady of 20 years' residence once said to me, quote, awfully funny, end quote. You are out in the hot glaring sun with no shade over you. A Japanese acquaintance passes by. You accost him, and instantly his hat is off. Well, that is perfectly natural. But the, quote, awfully funny, end quote, performance is that all the while he talks with you, his parasol is down, and he stands in the glaring sun also. How foolish! Yes, exactly so, provided the motive were less than this. Quote, you are in the sun, I sympathize with you. I would willingly take you under my parasol, if it were large enough, or if we were familiarly acquainted. As I cannot shade you, I will share your discomforts. End quote. Little acts of this kind, equally or more amusing, are not mere gestures or conventionalities. They are the, quote, bodying forth, end quote, of thoughtful feelings for the comfort of others. Another, quote, awfully funny, end quote, custom is dictated by our canons of politeness, but many superficial writers on Japan have dismissed it by simply attributing it to the general topsy-turviness of the nation. Every foreigner who has observed it will confess the awkwardness he felt in making proper reply upon the occasion. In America, when you make a gift, you sing its praises to the recipient. In Japan, we depreciate it or slander it. The underlying idea with you is, quote, "This is a nice gift. If it were not nice, I would not dare give it to you, for it will be an insult to give you anything but what is nice." End quote. In contrast to this, our logic runs, quote, "You are a nice person, and no gift is nice enough for you. You will not accept anything I can lay at your feet, except as a token of my good will. So accept this, not for its intrinsic value, but as a token. It will be an insult to your worth to call the best gift good enough for you." End quote. Place the two ideas side by side, and we see that the ultimate idea is one and the same. Neither is quote-unquote awfully funny. The American speaks of the material which makes the gift. The Japanese speaks of the spirit which prompts the gift. It is perverse reasoning to conclude, because our sense of propriety shows itself in all the smallest ramifications of our deportment, to take the least important of them and uphold it as the type, and pass judgment upon the principle itself. Which is more important, to eat or to observe rules of propriety about eating? A Chinese sage answers, quote, "If you take a case where the eating is all important, and the observing the rules of propriety is of little importance, and compare them together, why merely say that the eating is of the more importance?" End quote. Quote, "Metal is heavier than feathers." End quote. But does that saying have reference to a single clasp of metal and a wagon load of feathers? Take a piece of wood a foot thick and raise it above the pinnacle of a temple. None would call it taller than the temple. To the question, which is the more important, to tell the truth or to be polite, the Japanese are said to give an answer diametrically opposite to what Americans will say. But I forbear any comment until I come to speak of veracity or truthfulness, without which politeness is a farce and a show. End of section 3.